As we began our series, we first talked about background of the Screwtape Letters, how Lewis came to write it and why he used that literary form to communicate what he said in the hopes of getting past watchful dragons. Then we looked at hell as the canvas on which the letters are written, and a Lewisian doctrine or theology of hell. Then we looked at a main theme that runs through all the letters, and there are many themes, but there are three I thought were the biggest as I tried to put these lectures together, look at the three biggest themes. And the first was pride. Then last time we looked at akrasia, or the lust of deceit, self-deception. And now I want to look at issues relative to the sins of the flesh. Before I talk about this, though, there is a lecture that Miss Manners, do you guys read Miss Manners, Judith Martin? I actually like her stuff. I think it has a lot of theological significance. I don't know if she's a theologically oriented person, but anytime you deal with issues of etiquette, you're engaging in something that has some profound theological nature, I think. And she gave a lecture at Harvard University in the 1980s, and it was published, and it was called Common Courtesy, Miss Manners Solves the Problem That Baffled Mr. Jefferson. I don't think she really solves the problem in the lecture, but her concern was that Thomas Jefferson, when America started, wanted to come up with an etiquette for an egalitarian culture. In Europe, it was clear. You treated those in the hierarchy who were above you with respect, and you treated those beneath you in the hierarchy in a servile way. But how do you have an etiquette where everybody's supposed to be equal? What Jefferson thought is that everybody would treat each other well. Instead, what he discovered, people would say, well, you're no better than I am, and everybody treated each other poorly. And he couldn't figure it out. So Miss Manners tries to engage in how we might have an etiquette in an egalitarian culture, and what she's discovered is that we have new hierarchies. We tend to generally graduate towards some sort of hierarchy. So my wife, for example, she's very beautiful. She never gets tickets. The policemen pull her over. They come and they see her at the window and they say, oh, how are you today, Mrs. Root? It is Mrs., is it? It's not Miss, is it? She looks about 20 years younger than me. She's not. She's 2 years younger. She just has good genes. And she never gets tickets. Do you know what happens to a fat, bald guy with a beard and glasses when he gets pulled over? People don't get treated the same by a hierarchy of appearance. Some people get treated better because of athletic abilities. I have a friend who has a Super Bowl ring. He was a starting tight end in one of the Joe Montana Super Bowls. And he has a tendency to put the pedal to the metal, and he drives a little bit too fast. And anytime he gets pulled over, he looks in the rearview mirror to see which side the policeman's coming, and that's the hand he slips the Super Bowl ring on. And when somebody asks for his license, he hands them the license and makes sure that they see that ring, and they say, oh, gee, Mr. So-and-so, is that a Super Bowl ring? Yes, it is. Which one did you play in? Well, I was a tight end with Joe Montana. Really? What kind of a guy was Jerry Rice? Oh, it was a prince of a guy. Could I have your autograph? It's for my son, you see. It's not for me. He never gets tickets. Wealthy people don't get tickets. You know how it goes. We've got a hierarchy based on wealth. We've got a hierarchy based on fame. We've got a hierarchy based on athletic ability, hierarchies based on education, hierarchies based on appearance, and so on. She didn't solve the problem, really. She just let us know that we still operate at some level where we treat some people with respect, maybe artificially, and other people servile, inappropriately. And yet the high courtesy of heaven is that the God of the universe from Calvary said, I give my life for you. The high courtesy of heaven is my life for you. Screwtape, when he writes, particularly about the lust of the flesh and fleshly desire. He wants us to move away from that so that we might say, your life for me. He writes this in letter number 19, and it's a key concept to a discussion of the sins of the flesh as you seek to sort them out going through the various Screwtape letters. Screwtape writes, separate your patient's sexuality from all that might humanize it. To humanize desire is not to deny the desire, but to allow love and justice to guide and direct it to a place where we would begin to respect the humanity of the other person, not be self-referential and utilitarian, using other people for our own ends. Screwtape writes in letter 7, once you have made the world an end and faith a means, you have almost won your man, and it makes very little difference what kind of worldly end he is pursuing. So we see that Screwtape seeks to hold the patient in a state of confusion over real pleasure and artificiality, or the corruption of pleasure. In letter 9, Screwtape writes, we're informed that the devil cannot produce pleasures. Screwtape says all we can do is to encourage the humans to take pleasures which our enemy has produced at times, or in ways, or in degrees he has forbidden. Hence we always try to work away from the natural condition of any pleasure to that which is least natural, least redolent of its maker, and least pleasurable. An ever-increasing craving for an ever-diminishing pleasure is the formula. He tells us in that particular letter, Screwtape tells Wormwood, exploit the trough. Remember we talked about undulation? That we have these up and down periods in our life? He says exploit the trough, exploit the downtime. In other words, help your patient move towards pleasure as a kind of anesthetizing behavior. All of us are broken. Well, let me put it this way. All of us are wounded. Not necessarily all of us are broken. Brokenness, I think, is an awareness of our wound and how it affects us at some level. And our tendency, because of our woundedness, rather than bringing it to Jesus to begin the process of healing us, we will gravitate towards what I call anesthetizing behaviors. That's what Screwtape wants us to do. These behaviors are things like drug addiction, alcohol addiction, eating disorders, sexual addiction, workaholism. I know a guy who creates chaos in his world. Sort of his anesthetizing behavior. Create chaos for those people so that everybody's eyes are deflected on the chaos and they're deflected away from him. Hell's Angel type people, I haven't worked with that many, but enough of them to see a pattern. Everyone I got close to had a marshmallow heart. The hard veneer was to prevent anything from getting to that marshmallow heart. Lots of anesthetizing behaviors. But usually these anesthetizing behaviors get us by, they don't get us better. And usually as time comes, we pick up some convictions along the way, and the anesthetizing behaviors that got us by from our youth, these anesthetizing behaviors begin to operate in contrast to our convictions. They put us in the middle of Romans 7. The very thing I desire to do, I don't do, and the thing I find myself doing is not something I want to do. Who will set me free from these things? Paul says Christ will. How would that be? Why is it that we keep going back to these things even though they're contrary to our convictions? And I would like to suggest to you, our wounds are deeper than our convictions. Our wounds are deeper than our convictions. And if we're not finding the grace of God healing us in the places of our life, especially in the trough period, we become particularly susceptible to the sins of the flesh. And Screwtape has his way on us. Screwtape says, set him to work on the desperate design of recovering his old feelings by sheer willpower, and the game is ours. In The Pilgrim's Regress, the first book Lewis wrote that was explicitly Christian after he became a Christian, it was an allegorical, the only allegory Lewis wrote actually, but it was almost an autobiographical allegory. And John, this particular character who's the main pilgrim, he sees a vision of an island and it awakens in him a sense of desire. And he goes on this quest to try and find the island. And while he's on the quest, he begins to tether his heart's longing to objects that ultimately can't fulfill. He goes through what C.S. Lewis called the dialectic of desire. Tethers his heart to this thing, he's disappointed, tethers to this thing, is disappointed, tethers to this thing. And as C.S. Lewis said in Mere Christianity, if I find in my heart a desire that nothing in this earth can satisfy, it doesn't mean this world's a crock. It may mean that these things were only given to awaken desire, but never given to satisfy the desire. And maybe the desire is going to find in something that transcends this world. It's very interesting. But John tries to make these old feelings and desires that he has, he tries to make them work and attaches them to this brown girl. I think the reason why Lewis uses what we would call a brown girl is he's picking up on the kinds of things that Rousseau and Voltaire wrote about, particularly Rousseau in the Social Contract, where he says fairly early on in that work that man is born free, but everywhere we find him in chains. For him, the chains were social custom, civil law, canon law, church expectation. If we could get away from the church and get away from the encumbrances of the church, we would be truly free. We could live by instinct. And so they believed that there were cultures out there that if we could find a free culture unadulterated by Western values or the church, we would be able to live these licentious lives and everything would be fine. Now Rousseau in his autobiography said that he lived in a life of impulse. Lewis talks about why this life is not a good life in the second chapter of The Abolition of Man. But he tried to live this life, and by his own admission, he had 5 illegitimate children living that kind of life. And by his own admission, he left them with foundling homes in France at that time, were run mostly by the Catholic Church. He wanted other people to come along behind him and pick up the pieces of the broken lives that he was leaving in his wake, as he was self-referential and utilitarian. So they had this projected view that if we could get to Polynesia, for example, we would find these unadulterated cultures and we would find the free love that we're looking for. And so this brown girl kind of represents this idealized vision of licentiousness and free love. And all of a sudden, John has to discover in his own unrestrained expression of desire, he has to discover the destruction that he has caused. And consequently, in the moment he exercises his licentiousness, he has separated his sexuality from all that might humanize it, which is to see this other person as a person who has value in his or her own right, you see. In Dahmer, a book that Lewis wrote before he was a Christian, and again, I would encourage you to read that book. It's a narrative poem. It's about 100 pages long. I think it's one of his best books. Most people don't write it. It's a book he wrote before he was a Christian, but you can see almost all of his Christian ideas in seed in that book. In seed in the kinds of questions and questing he's engaged in, even though he will eventually find Christ as the answer to these questions. But Dahmer is in one adventure in this particular book, he ends up in the home of a magician. And the magician is a very Screwtape-like character. Almost, we could say, maybe a precursor to Screwtape in one of Lewis's earliest books. And the magician tries to get Dahmer to engage in a life of dreams and unrealities. And in this particular dream, the magician causes him to engage in a dalliance. And Dahmer awakens from the dream, realizing something's not wrong. And here's what Lewis writes, as Dahmer is reflecting. There I was, nearly wrecked, but mark the rest. This woman who came to him in his dreams with her sexual favors, she went too fast. Soft to my arms she came. The robe slipped from her shoulder. The smooth breast was against my own. She shone like flame before me in the dusk, all love, all shame. Faugh! It was myself. But all was well, for at the least that moment snapped the spell. In other words, he came to the realization that this woman in his dreams was just a projection of his fantasies, and it was leading him into unreality, and he wakes up at that moment. These are real human beings that we engage with in the lusts of the flesh, and we hurt them. And in the consequence, we lose our own humanity in the process. Matter of fact, Dahmer starts to leave the magician's house, and the magician wants everybody to live by these dreams of self-referentialism, self-centeredness. And so when Dahmer leaves, the magician shoots him because the magician doesn't want Dahmer to break free of the projection on reality that the magician himself has. What's the antidote to lust? Basically, it's reality. People, not projections, is one of the antidotes. To see another person as he or she really is. And that's why Screwtape again says, separate his sexuality from all that might humanize it. Separate it from reality. Separate it from virtue as a means to pleasure, and lead them towards vice and unrestrained expression that doesn't take into account the humanity of another person. In letter 13, Screwtape warns Wormwood not to allow his patient to experience real pleasure. The characteristic of pains and pleasures, he writes, is that they are unmistakably real, and therefore, as far as they go, give the man who feels them a touchstone of reality. He writes, how can you have failed to see that a real pleasure was the last thing you ought to have him meet? Because a real pleasure would see things as they are, not as he would have them be. In an experiment in criticism, Lewis said, in coming to understand anything, we must accept the facts as they are, not as they are for us. And then we see here mentioned, what I mentioned in our first lecture, Wordsworth's transforming imagination, its projection. In letter 17, this is where he talked about the gluttony of delicacy, and we talked about that under pride. But Lewis finishes his discussion of the gluttony of delicacy by talking about this woman who wants all I want state of mind. I want it like this, I want it like that. She has in her mind what she wants. He says at the end of that particular statement, she doesn't mind what she eats herself, but does like to have things nice for her boy. In fact, of course, her greed has been one of the chief sources of the boy's domestic discomfort for many years. She thinks she's doing right by the boy, but she's projecting on the boy what she wants the boy to be like, rather than being concerned to let the boy be what he ought to be. This woman shows up often in the corpus of Lewis's work. And again, self-referential and so on. I want to read you about her in The Four Loves. There's a wonderful passage about this woman. She's known as Mrs. Fidget. And it may take me a second here to find her. Lewis writes on affection, which is, in this case, mother love gone wrong, because it will not allow the child to be what the mother wants the child to be. It wants the child to be a projection. I mean, it won't allow the child to be what the child should be. Mother nurturing the child to fullness of life, but instead the mother projecting on the child. I'll give you a quick story of the worst case I ever saw of this. Many years ago, I was a college pastor out in California in the 1970s, and I had this young man in my college group, and he was, something was wrong with him. Our kids loved on him. They made sure he was included in everything. He didn't have a driver's license. He was 19, 20 years old. And one day his social worker called me and said, you know, I've been working with Ricky and his family for many years, and we've never seen him make such progress as he's made since he's come to your college group. And I knew it was because our kids loved on him. He was difficult. He was an odd guy. And she said, I said, well, our kids love on him. They make sure he's included and so on. And I said, is he developmentally disabled? Is there a mental problem with him? She says, oh, no, he's very, very bright. He's just socially disabled. He was the last child of a dysfunctional marriage. The father was a workaholic and the mother felt abandoned. So what she did was she made her son, basically, her doll. And the social worker said she wouldn't even let him dress himself and comb his own hair till he was 18 years old. And she destroyed her son. It's horrible. But again, it was her needs as the triumphal issue and not concerned about the welfare of the son. It's not sexual lasciviousness, but it is still the destruction of another person for one's own personal interest. Here she is. She appears many places in Lewis's writings. You'll find her as one of the ghosts in The Great Divorce and so on. But this is probably the best short, poignant expression of her. I am thinking of Mrs. Fidget, who died a few months ago. It is really astonishing how her family have brightened up. The drawn look is gone from her husband's face. He begins to be able to laugh. The younger boy, whom I had always thought an embittered, peevish little creature, turns out to be quite human. The elder, who was hardly ever at home except when he was in bed, is nearly always there now and has begun to reorganize the garden. And the daughter, who was always supposed to be delicate, though I never found out exactly what the trouble was, now has the riding lessons which were once out of the question, dances all night, and plays any amount of tennis. Even the dog, who was never allowed out except on the lead, is now a well-known member of the lamppost club in their road. Mrs. Fidget very often said that she lived for her family, and it was not untrue. Everyone in the neighborhood knew it. She lives for her family, they said. What a wife and mother. She did all the washing, true. She did it badly, and they could have afforded to send it out to a laundry, and they frequently begged her not to do it, but she did. There was always a hot lunch for anyone who was at home, and always a hot meal at night, even in midsummer. They implored her not to provide this. They protested almost with tears in their eyes, and with truth, that they liked cold meals. It made no difference. She was living for her family. She always set up to welcome you home if you were out late at night. 2 or 3 in the morning, it made no odds. You would always find the frail, pale, weary face awaiting you like a silent accusation. Which meant, of course, that you couldn't with any decency go out very often. She was always making things too, being in her own estimation, I'm no judge myself, an excellent amateur dressmaker and great knitter. And of course, unless you were a heartless brute, you had to wear the things. The vicar tells me that since her death, the contributions of that family alone to sales of work outweigh those of all of his other parishioners put together. And then her care for their health. She bore the whole burden of that daughter's delicacy alone. The doctor, an old friend, and it was not being done on national health, was never allowed to discuss matters with his patient. After the briefest examination of her, he was taken into another room by the mother. The girl was to have no worries, no responsibility for her own health, only loving care, caresses, special foods, horrible tonic wines, and breakfast in bed. For Mrs. Fidget, as she so often said, would work her fingers to the bone for her family. They couldn't stop her, nor could they, being decent people, quite sit still and watch her do it. They had to help. Indeed, they were always having to help. That is, they did things for her to help her to do things for them which they didn't want done. As for the dear dog, it was to her, she said, just like one of the children. It was, in fact, as like one of them as she could make it. But since it had no scruples, it got on rather better than they, and though vetted, dieted, and guarded within an inch of its life, contrived sometimes to reach the dustbin or the dog next door. The vicar says Mrs. Fidget is now at rest. Let us hope she is. What's quite certain is that her family are. Now, don't think Lewis is picking on women. If you want to read the same kind of expose on a man, read the essay, The Sermon in the Lunch in God in the Dock, where Lewis finds a man who is abusive towards his family in this same sort of way, self-referential, utilitarian. In letter 20, we see that Screwtape says this to Wormwood. The goal, he says, is to produce in every age a general misdirection of what may be called sexual taste. Here, sexual taste is the abuse of another person for my own ends, but it's abuse of another person in a particular way. With Mrs. Fidget and with the pastor in the Sermon on the Lunch, it's in a more generalized way. To produce in every age a general misdirection of what may be called sexual tastes. This they do by working through the small circle of popular artists, dressmakers, actresses, and advertisers who determine the fashionable type. As a result, we are more and more, Screwtape writes, directing the desires of men to something which does not exist, making the role of the eye in sexuality more and more important, at the same time making its demands more and more impossible. Again, I've already mentioned the use of undulation as a seedbed for temptation. That's in letter number 8. But again, Lewis advises Wormwood to exploit trough times. In letter 25, we see this. There's the horror of the same old thing. The lust then for novelty. You can't get a person to be satisfied in their present state. They have to lust for something that's beyond what's in their own pasture or their own world. God, who is immutable, created the mutability of time. He even entered it himself. He gives to his creatures a love of permanence as well as a love of change or variety. God seeks to gratify both of these loves via the rhythms of life. To overindulge one side of the permanence variety struggle is to neglect the other. To play to eternity while failing at temporal responsibilities is Gnostic. So too, to play to time while failing at eternal responsibilities is damnable. The antidote to the excesses of change is permanence. The antidote to the excesses of permanence is to discover delight in the particular. Screwtape seeks to exaggerate the pleasures of either, to make an end of it. He seeks to destroy balance and the struggle that brings about balance, and this results in diminished pleasure and increased desire. So the pleasure of novelty is subject to the law of diminishing returns. And this leads to susceptibility to fashion or vogues and so on. Now, Screwtape's goal basically is to produce that nonsense in the intellect which reinforces corruption in the will. I want to see if I can play this out a little bit. I had a student come to me, this was probably about 14 years ago now. He was one of my advisees. I didn't have him in a class that semester. He knocks on the door. I didn't have office hours, but I opened the door, and there he is, standing there. He looked horribly disheveled. I said to him, "You don't look very good." He said, "I'm not very good. I'm not well at all. I'm seeing a psychiatrist. I'm on antidepressants. I'm seeing a psychologist. I wanted to come by and talk with you." I said, "What is it? Sit down." He said, "It's lust." He said, "It's consuming me. It's destroying me. I don't have any moment, waking moment, where I'm not focused and fixated on this." I knew the student fairly well, and I had never seen any predatory expression on his part. So I said to him, "Describe for me this lust." What he described for me is what I would call normative sexual desire for a horny 20-year-old college guy. I said, "You describe for me sexual desire, not lust." Sexual desire, I said, isn't lust any more than hunger is gluttony. Sexual desire is predatory. The word epithumia in the Greek, it's translated lust, it's used positively in the Bible as well. In Philippians chapter 1, when Paul says to live as Christ, to die as gain, he says, "I desire to depart and be with Christ." And the word he uses there is epithumia, lust. I am predatory about finishing well this life that I'm walking in Christ. I already mentioned the lust of deceit. It's the same word, epithumia, in Ephesians chapter 4. Lust is predatory. Lust seeks to entrap. I said to this young man, "Where did you get the idea that to be normal was wrong?" And Screwtape, in a sense, had his way in a different direction, you see. He had heard in sermons, Matthew passage, if a man looks at a woman to lust after her, it's as if he committed adultery with her. And that passage had been interpreted to him in a sermon that if a man looks on a woman and just notices her, that he's committed this sin. So he has to go around living as if there is no reality in his world. And he moves towards what I would call Gnosticism. Gnosticism was that belief that the material is bad and the spiritual is good. The hyper-Gnostics were called docetics. They believed that if the material is bad, Jesus couldn't have come in the body, and therefore they believe he came in a phantom body. The flesh is not bad. God made the flesh. Jesus came in the flesh. We'll be raised with the flesh. Paul says the flesh becomes bad in Galatians 5 when it sets its desire against the spirit. It causes a person to be split off. God wants to bring these things together. In the incarnation, we find these things brought together even in the life of Christ. And true spirituality brings these things together in a kind of balance. So I said to this young man, "Are you a sexual person?" He didn't even know how to answer that. He struggled. I said, "It's like asking, do you have brown eyes, blue eyes, or hazel eyes?" He finally said, "Well, yeah, I guess I am." I said, "Who made you that way?" He said, "God." I said, "Yeah, have you ever worshiped him for it?" Well, that was totally incongruous to him. that he could worship God for the way he was in this particular area. I said, this is a gift God has given to you. Let's worship him. So we started thanking God for his sexuality. After we prayed and thanked God and made it an act of worship rather than an act of self-denial, in a sense, of inappropriate self-denial, we then started talking about the spiritual disciplines, about virtue, and how to cultivate the spiritual disciplines in a life of faithful following of Christ and sanctification, so that he could manage his life well as he matured, rather than vectoring off and living either in denial of the realities of his life or overindulging these particular things and given license to them rather than putting bit and bridle in them. One of the best expressions of this in Lewis is in The Great Divorce, where of all these creatures who come up from hell, all of them end up getting back on the bus and go back to hell but one. And the one who gets on into heaven is the guy who comes walking up to an angel with a red lizard on his shoulder. And Lewis says the red lizard was the lizard of lust. And the lizard is riding the man, trying to control the man. And the man is given in to its ways. It's unlicensed, lascivious behavior. And consequently, this man is so destroyed, and the angel says, let me kill it. And he says, oh, no, I know he doesn't fit in here, but I don't want to kill him. It ends up through great struggle. Finally, the man gives way to the way of God in his life, and he takes the lizard and he throws it on the ground, and this ghost, this shade, this less than fully human man who has given his life to inappropriate expressions of desire, he falls down on the ground too. And then as Lewis describes what he sees the man resurrected up into a real man, a thick man, a man of substance now. But he also sees the lizard transformed. And the lizard is turned into a white stallion, huge, powerful, bigger and stronger than it ever was. And the man now goes to the angel, and he falls on his knees and thanks him. And then he goes over to the horse and he rubs his nose in the nose of the horse, claps it on the neck, and mounts the horse. Now we've got horse and rider right, where it was lizard and man before. And he rides it on into heaven, these two things reconciled in his life. His physical life as well as his spiritual life, into sort of a whole expression of what spirituality is. And Lewis, as he gives us the upside down image through Screwtape, is basically inviting us back into this holistic approach. Screwtape tells Wormwood, we want cattle who can finally become food, but God wants servants who can finally become sons. We want to suck in, he wants to give out. Screwtape will try to make man in his image, or God will remake us in the image of his son. All choice moves us one way or another towards the miserific vision or the beatific vision. C.S. Lewis said, you've never met a mere mortal. We live in a world of possible gods and goddesses, or devils and imps. And we are all the while helping people towards one or other of these. And if we're self-referential and utilitarian, we're probably hurting others, and we're also denying our own humanity. But if we become self-aware, we can also then become empathetic towards others and encourage them. So next talk, we'll look at the way we can escape the wiles of the evil one.